Hi, and thanks everyone for joining our webinar today. We are talking about writing a secure app with Google's Polymer front end and the Java Spring Services micro backend. My name is Scott Deeg, and what we're talking about today, first I'll tell you, obviously this, our agenda, what we're talking about, a little bit about myself, and kind of a little bit about how we got here, what we're making. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about Google's Polymer and web components. If you're not sure what that is, hopefully you'll have an idea after we're done here. For a general backend on our app, we're going to look at delivering our UI and microservices with Spring, and security, of course, being very important. We're going to be talking a little bit about that, HTTP and session-based security. We'll see if we get a little chance to throw in some OAuth. Most of this will be oriented around demos. We'll do some introduction to the concepts, especially with Polymer web components, but really the meat of it is about building an app. I want to show you guys kind of how all of this stuff really comes together. So I am just kind of a plain old Java geek. I got my start with Java almost 20 years ago now at Symantec, and have been working in it since then. A lot of times that's been in kind of a professional services type role around some Java-based BPM products. I joined VMware when SpringSource was acquired, and been fortunate enough to watch the expansion of all things kind of Spring and the platform to support it behind it. And we all, of course, rolled into Pivotal here in 2013. My life's usually spent in the enterprise. I'm not on the Spring team core. I'm really more of a kind of like, I think a lot of you are, consumers of Spring and a user. And this is a little bit about what my journey is on kind of writing my own app. So this came about through a need that I had. I had a tool that I was writing. After some basic functionality, I needed to start putting a UI on it. Initially, was looking at AngularJS, as that's a very popular framework these days. But through some of the discussions, especially on the Spring list, I saw that other frameworks were coming up, and there were kind of suggestions that Angular had kind of lived out maybe its life, being about 6 years old. Plus these days. And Polymer was suggested as an interesting way to go, and I went and kind of started looking at that, and that kind of has led to a lot of this. I also, at the same time, wanted some security. So my application is posted out on the public web on our Pivotal Web Services, which is Cloud Foundry on Amazon. And security to obscurity, while fine and dandy, is really just a little too open. And while my app wouldn't have done anything bad, still would like to have a little bit of security on it. Right around this time, Dave Sire was writing his blog on AngularJS and a secure Spring backend. And he mentioned several times, if you have seen any of those, that it was really relevant. So I decided that I was going to take the Dave Sire challenge, and I was going to use his concepts on security, use this new kind of UI framework, and marry them all together with the tool that I was writing. It's a beautiful tool, not so much. I don't spend too much time on the UI, but this is kind of my master control program that I use and that I've been writing. And you'll see as we build up the application as we go along kind of how it leads to something like this. And what I'll be giving you guys kind of at the end of the talk or ultimately posting is a somewhat genericized version of this application for you guys to use. That application itself is based off, what we today call kind of a modern app architecture. We have a user interface that's a single-page application being based on Java, using JavaScript and hosted in the browser, making backend calls with Ajax. We are going to be using Google Polymer to build that. And then the whole microservices type backend is going to be built with Spring Boot and RESTful web services, and we're going to use that also then to control ultimately the security for the application. Our initial architecture is very simple. We'll be expanding this out a little bit, but really this is how a lot of our apps work these days, kind of from the highest level, which is we have some server delivering a UI. We've got a client, which is our browser, and then we have that talking to a variety of services to either do things for us or to get information about maybe what's going on in our environment to then power our application. So this is kind of the first start we're going to do, and we'll expand on this ultimately towards the end. First, though, we're talking about this Google Polymer thing, and we're talking about this front end. Take a little bit of time here to talk about what that is. So it is from Google. I've searched around a little bit for a variety of definitions. This one kind of seemed to be, I think, the best one. which is the Polymer core provides a thin layer of API on top of web components. It expresses Polymer's opinion, provides the extra sugaring that all Polymer elements use, and is meant to help developing web components much easier, right? With the basic philosophy that everything in the world is an element. So let's unpack this a little bit. By elements, what we're talking about is we're talking about web components or web elements. We're talking about things like buttons and input fields and tab controls. These types of things are web elements, the things we use to build web interfaces. So Polymer is about making these elements. It is, as I kind of rolling it backwards through here, it is extra stuff on top of this thing called web components, where web component, it's an API then on top of web components. So understanding Polymer really requires us to kind of understand what web components are in a basic sense. So those are coming from our friends over at the W3C, the group that builds all of our web standards. And what are called web components are really this set of standards that are being put together that help us define in a specific way how to build custom web components. This thing called Shadow DOM, which is a way that we kind of hide and encapsulate parts of our DOM tree inside of our browser. HTML templates and HTML imports are the core sort of set of standards that we call web components. Again, all defined by the W3C. If you're interested in kind of researching these standards a little bit deeper, their website is webcomponents.org, where you can find all kinds of interesting information there in terms of browser support. So we can see now how well the browsers are supporting these standards, Chrome having great support, all the way down to IE in its typical position with standard supports. If you wanted to read the specs, for example, you're really interested in the specification for Shadow DOM, you can come link in over to it here, and you'll actually go ahead and get down here into the actual specification for it. Riveting reading, I am sure. But it's all laid out there. It's the custom elements, the imports, and templates, and the Shadow DOM. And our popular libraries. So Polymer is the library really sitting on top of these web components. There's others, such as Xtag, which you may have heard of from Mozilla, also on top of web components. For browsers that don't support web components yet, and most of them don't really fully support them, there is a polyfill, which implements all of the behavior that ultimately will be supported by the browsers eventually once they finally get that far. Chrome already has full support, so Google actually donated the polyfill to webcomponents.org, so it's available for everyone. Since Chrome already has support, they don't really care anymore. They've moved on. But that is available, and that is something that we'll also be making use of. The custom element is really kind of central to the whole concept here, not simply of kind of web components, but also Polymer. And a custom element is really nothing more than the ability to come in and put things in your HTML that you have defined. So I can put something in here just like this. In my HTML, that might say my cool element. That is something that I've defined. It uses the standard mechanism of passing in attributes for data, so I can set some variable foo to bar, passing that in, and that's what I want to be able to do. Easy way to extend HTML with my code so that ultimately I can reduce the amount of code I have to write because I have great reuse. I get great expression of the function of my code through the kind of higher level expression of it. I encapsulate all the details of it. And ultimately, just trying to make it much easier and much more straightforward to go ahead and do this type of work. Many of the frameworks have been pushing these ideas and making progress on these ideas, Angular being one of those. But this is now going to be the standard, the W3C standard for how we do custom elements. To make some of this work in web components, we also have this idea of the shadow DOM. So the DOM is the model of all of our components in a tree. So we start with a root, and then we have the children and the subchildren of those. With our shadow DOM, when I put one of my custom elements on there, it has a shadow DOM. So from the outside, you don't see any children. What this does is it gives you great isolation, and you don't have any problems with leakage of attributes or name collisions or these types of things because the main DOM tree doesn't see the children of the subtree. That's one of the ways we're able to implement these components the way we are. Another thing that allows us to do this are HTML templates. These allow us to declare HTML code and then say, take this template and use it again and again and again. This can be something that just makes it easy to stamp out in a number of pages. Or if I have things like repeating sections in a list and I want to declare what that section is going to look like for each element, I would use an HTML template to do that. Again, not necessarily a new idea, but now our standard way for going ahead and approaching this problem using HTML templates. And HTML import, I don't know what to say. It's so obvious when you see it, you can't believe it wasn't there all along. So we'll see that in action when we get there. So those are web components, and those are the standards. Polymer, then, what Google is giving us then is a framework that sits on top of it. And like all good frameworks, the goal of it is to really make it easy to consume those very low-level, kind of very primitive standards. So while in web components, I may programmatically create a component, and then I may create a shadow DOM and attach them together, what Polymer allows me to do is to declaratively express what I want that to look like. And then it does all of that back-end work to create all of the web component stuff to pull it together and bring that whole component together easily. It provides us additional functionality in terms of two-way data binding so that I'm able to attach data to various DOM elements and update them and have that propagated around. It's a good model for dealing with events, both capturing standard events and firing standard events, such as internal button clicks out, or firing custom events from the inside out as well. Property observation is natively built in. So if I have a property called foo, I can simply write a handler called foo changed, and it'll be called automatically. Polymer also provides us with abilities for component inheritance. So if I want to define a root and then inherit off that to extend functionality. Along with that kind of core library that sits on top of the web components are two optional sets of graphic and non-graphic and non-UI elements to go along with it. So Polymer provides two sets, which are the core and the paper-based elements. So core elements are your general set of elements, these buttons, lists, etc. The paper elements are based off of what Google calls material design, and you can find explanation of what Google thinks material design is about and what that means. The paper elements are then an implementation for use in Polymer of the material design concept. And if we take then a little look about where to go for information about Polymer, all things Polymer start at polymerproject.org. You can see here you've got links to a variety of things. One thing you'll notice, though, is that Polymer is still a dev preview. So while it's on production track, we are still kind of early on, and we should expect that things will continue to change in this project and that not everything is fully robust. From here, you can also get information on the elements. So I can look at the core elements. I can look at the paper elements. The paper elements, if you're interested in getting a look at those, perhaps Google's idea of what input fields should look like and how they should operate, you can go ahead and take a look at these. And you can see these are specific web elements now that we have available for us to use. One of the really cool things about basing all this on standards, though, is that despite the fact that it's Google, there's Xtag that's out there, also based off of web components, providing a whole different component set. And since they're all based off the same standard, the idea is to make these things interoperable and have a common way of communicating, common way of dealing with it, so that we have a lot more choice in terms of what we're able to do. And the Polymer guys do go and make a good effort to work with the Xtag guys to make sure there's good compatibility there. So that's what our elements are about. And data binding, of course, is an extremely important feature inside. Something that we saw previously with some of the other frameworks, Angular, of course, being one of those, this ability to kind of define these data elements and have those bound. Polymer continuing along on that theme and having actually a good separation of what our UI is, built in our DOM, from ultimately what the data is for components, which is the model. Sounds a little strange, but that data model is actually bound to the elements. So I do have the UI and I do have the data kind of together. But it makes a little more sense when you see it. They are actually fairly well separated, and we kind of then use a template to go ahead and help us along this. So the template then defines our UI. We stamp it out into an instance. It contains a single copy of all of our content, and then we have Polymer and the templates maintaining two-way bindings so that if I change my DOM, I go in and I enter a value for, say, example, in an input field. That value is then reflected back into the ultimate model, and then that model can then propagate it off even into other components. All right, so enough of the talking and the intro. Let's go ahead and actually maybe start building out our app here and taking a look at what some of this stuff looks like. And I think when we do start seeing it like this, it starts to make a lot more sense as well. So here I am in Spring Source Tool Suite, our old friend, and I am going to start by creating a project. We create the Spring Starter project. I'll just keep the default names. I'll choose Java 8. This is a jar packaging. Since we are kind of living in the modern world now, we're going to go ahead and package this up as an individual standalone app. And then we have many dependencies that we can choose from. So if you're not familiar with the way Spring and Spring Boot work, I select these various pieces of technology, and simply by kind of importing them, I gain the functionality from them. So I'm going to go ahead and select web because I want a web-based functionality and finish that off. And that's going to generate a project for me. If I look in this project, nothing particularly scary. We've got simply an entry point with a main, and we have the magic tag, Spring Boot application, which says make this a boot application and have unicorns and rainbows come out and do wonderful things for us. I've got a couple empty standard directories and an empty application standard property file. If I look at my POM really quickly here, something we're going to see is we're going to see that what was generated inside my dependencies block for Maven is that I want something called Spring Boot Starter Web. What I'm doing by checking that and by including this dependency is I'm including in a bunch of jar files that implement web-type technology. So I've got Tomcat and things of this sort. That, along with our annotation for our app, we're going to go ahead and make this now a fully functioning web application, albeit one with absolutely no content in it. So let's go ahead and provide at least some sort of content to start with. It's a web app, so we'll do index.html to get ourselves going. Put a head on it. Hello world. And we are going to run this, just a regular old Java application. You can see it's starting up down here at the bottom. Launch new window. All right, localhost and hello world. So one of the reasons that I do this, set it up this way, is that for Polymer to work, for using and working with this technology, we do need to have it hosted out of some type of a live container. It doesn't have to be a Tomcat server. It doesn't have to be a Java app. It could be a Node app. It could be Apache. It could be PHP, whatever it is that you have around that would dish it out. I'm a Java guy. We're going to make a Java backend anyway, so it's quick and easy for me to go ahead and spin this up, especially with Spring Boot, just a couple annotations, and I have this fully functioning web application for me to work with. So we've got our app going. We've got an initial framework for us to work with. We've got simple index.html. So let's go ahead and start building a UI, and let's explore this first really kind of fundamental concept, which is, how do we build a component? So first things first, let's go ahead and I'm going to use Bower, which is a resource. I'm going to make a directory. Then Bower is a dependency manager for JavaScript. Called Polymer demo. This initializes Polymer with configuration. Looks great. And now I'm going to do an install here of Polymer. So I'm saying Bower, go out and get it. It's going to come back. It sees that I have some dependencies on web components. That's my polyfill. I have a dependency on something called core component page. And it downloads all that. If we look at our components, then we can see all those came in our project. We've got JavaScript and we've got our components. All right, so we've used Bower to go ahead and import basically Polymer into our project. In our HTML now, I am going to, first things first, import the polyfill. So in Chrome, it should actually be redundant, right? And it should also be ignored because Chrome already implements all this stuff natively. But for those browsers that don't, we include the polyfill using the standard script tag. And then right after that, we use the amazingly obvious, can't believe it wasn't there the whole time, HTML import that is part of our web components, and just simply import something we're going to call the greeting display. So since these are elements and we like to separate this stuff out, we have a nice sort of component model. I'm going to use kind of what seems to be a standard, which is to put my components in a directory called elements. And we will call this greeting display HTML. Grab ourselves a little bit of starter code. So here I'm importing Polymer, and you'll notice just the base Polymer library, nothing to do with the core elements or the paper elements. I define my Polymer element and give it a name, and then inside of the element is a template. This template, this HTML template now, is what's going to get wrapped up, and it's going to get created. It's going to get stamped out, and this is going to become our shadow DOM for our component. So I save this. I've got a div section in there with a little bit of information. We'll unwrap a little bit as we get going. Come back here now. That's still hello world because we didn't do anything yet. We'll get rid of this and we'll go greeting display. And presto, we've just completed our first component and used it inside of an HTML page using the HTML import and our custom tag. So pretty easy, right? Get that kind of up and rolling. Doesn't have much in the way of data, so let's add some data to our component. Data is added using JavaScript. So if I am doing something, if I'm doing simply a pure display sort of component where I don't really need to have any script run, I can use this tag called noScript, which what it does is it provides kind of a default. But not doing that, I'm going to go ahead and add a script tag. And for all of our Polymer elements this way, what we want to do is we want to use this Polymer function. NoScript simply calls Polymer with no attributes or no parameters. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass a JSON block that then has kind of all of our initialization, has a bunch of other elements that we're going to add to this ultimate Polymer element. So Polymer function there allows me to override the created lifecycle function. I redefine this, and I define the piece of data inside of my component now called greeting. So greeting has a structure, ID and content. This is what I'm using up there. So this is where I'm using my model inside of my element, separated from my UI. So my UI is in my template. My model is down here being defined in my script. I'm saying this, which refers to my element. That greeting defines it, and then it gives it this. Inside of it, since I have data binding, inside of my template now, I'm able to refer to that piece of data and its contents using the double curly bracket notation. So this should now load all of this right into there. Since that'll all be bound, I save that. and now I see my data coming in. So I've got some default data going. That's great. I've got some displays. I've got full component operating. I've got ability to go ahead and configure it. That's well and good. Anytime we're dealing with UI, something that we're going to want to think about is how we deal with the layout. So let's take a little bit of a look at how we structure things. To do this, now I'm going to start using some of the core elements. So I will take this one. I'm going to drop it in my HTML. And I'm going to take my custom control, my custom element now, and I'm going to put it in a div section called content. I don't actually have these yet. So let's go out and get both the custom elements, or the core elements, using Bower. So I just told Bower to go out and download all these things, which are the core elements. You see all of those show up here. Things such as the core header panel and the toolbar. These are all now in here, now available for me to use, right? If you want to look at what these components look like, very much recommend coming in and taking a look. You can see they also use Bower. You can see what that core header panel actually looks like. Good practice inside of my HTML here is to actually kind of import them individually. I'm going to not do that, and I'm just going to go ahead and grab it over here. And I'm just going to kind of make use of something convenient here. And I'm going to import all the core elements. So when this page loads, it's going to load all this stuff in for me. I've got access to all of it. Just makes it easy here, especially for development. Just do a quick load on that. So I've got my core header, toolbar, got a little title up there, got my greeting. We'll take a look and see how our layout looks like and what Polmyer does for layouts. Something really not so very good. I discovered this as I was going along, is that Polmyer is a little sensitive to kind of how things are set up in terms of styling and things. So it really likes to, when you have these sort of layout problems, add these types of attributes into the body. So tell it that it's going to go out to the edge, it's got a vertical layout, things need to be kind of resolved later, it's an unresolved layout. This is going to give Polmyer some hints that it needs to be doing more work for what it needs to be doing. And if I come in now, actually I have a layout that works pretty good. So be a little mindful of that if you're playing with Polmyer, that it is a little sensitive to having this up there. So good. I've got a layout now. I've got some custom elements going. I've got HTML imports going. We're controlling it with scripts. We've got a model. What are we missing? Oh, let's make it look a little prettier. Let's add some styling. Styling elements, very straightforward. These are nothing more than standard DOM elements and DOM components. So I can deal with them in the way that I would any others, meaning I'm just going to go ahead and use CSS. One thing I can do here is do it directly inside of my component, and I'll create a style called bubble. And I'll give it some styling. So easy, standard CSS styling. If I was looking to maybe control some of the specific elements or standard elements, for example, let's say I wanted to control the look of this toolbar. Same thing, CSS. For the style, we'll set a style on our core toolbar. Background color, we'll make it red. Awesome. All right. So yeah, style control, standard inside of the component itself. This is really nice, again, very nice and encapsulated. So things are not going to necessarily be leaking out all over the place because it's just right inside there, inside of that shadow DOM. Good control, though, for our componentry, though, from the outside, especially mostly, I'd say, good control. There are some nuances on that we'll get to as we kind of look at some of the more complex controls. Maybe some of the ways Polmyer guys could have made things a little easier to get at. But this one was certainly very easy to go ahead and get to. And so I think we've done a lot. We've got a lot of layout stuff going on here. We've got data. We've got displays and styles and colors. A couple things to note at this point and some of the best practices as given to us by the guys over at Web Components. The first one, not a best practice. If you remember, I had a hyphen greeting dash display, and you'll see as an example here, this has app dash pages. A dash in an element name is actually required. This distinguishes precisely all custom elements from all standard HTML components. So there are no standard HTML components that have a dash. So if all of our custom elements have to have a dash, then we always know what a custom element is. So that's actually a requirement. So use a dash in the element name. There's great examples out there. The Google stuff's open. We kind of saw where we could go grab some of that and take a look at it ourselves inside the library itself. So definitely take a look at and mimic the patterns that are there. And follow good patterns, generally. Pass data in through attributes, into elements, receive events out to get data out of the elements. Don't do a lot of hard linking, assumptions about what's going on the inside. Don't put too much in your shadow DOM. Don't be crazy about how many custom elements you need. All of that stuff type of adds overhead, right? It's great to have these features, but especially now with the new technologies, we do need to be a little mindful on that while we're creating it. You keep everything kind of at a reasonable pace, and so far my experience has been the interfaces work very well. So plenty about the front end there. Let's go ahead and think about the back end and then pull them all together. Fortunately, the back end is very, very straightforward for us. In general, what we need is a service to give us some data, right? The services I had on the back end of my app returned all kinds of interesting reporting data and large JSON structures and things used for graphs and lists and things of that sort. For our purposes, though, we just need some sort of a service to give us some data back to simulate that. Spring, of course, does that very easily inside of controllers and using the kind of controller metaphor to define a RESTful endpoint in our boot app, and we'll be doing that. And then after that, we'll go ahead and add the elements into our application to go ahead and bind to that service or retrieve the information from that service and then bind that automatically into our visualization, into our UI elements, our DOM. So I'm sure many of you have seen this. We will go ahead and inside of our app, look at that all the time. Since we already had web available to us, I can go ahead and say, make this a RESTful controller. So I'm now telling boot that I want, and this annotation is coming in saying that they want to make this class not simply the main point, but also a controller to deliver RESTful data. And then copy and paste a service for ourselves. This service here, not doing very much. Any request to /resource will then create a map object, shove a random string into it and a message, and then return that object. So from the Spring side, that's about all we've got to do to go ahead and create our service, quick example service. Real services in many ways are just kind of a extension of this basic sort of concept. And when I write my services, I do the front ends on this pretty much almost exactly the same way. If I come over here now, we'll do localhost resource. And we can see that framework and everything just marshaled all that stuff for us straight into JSON. Thank you very much, very convenient. And now I hit that service, and it comes back as any JSON data source that you'd be accessing out there on the web. So easy to get started with that on the Spring side. So that's happiness. Now, what do we do over on the Polymer side to go ahead and link these return values from the service into what we're actually seeing? So what we do on the Polymer side is we use this thing called a core AJAX control. I'm going to dump it in here right after my style. So this is here in my template. It is another Polymer element. This is actually a core element, not specifically tied to Polymer, but based off of it. So this is core AJAX. I'm saying here is an AJAX endpoint. It's a non-UI element. One thing that's interesting about doing all these components is that we can have UI ones that show us stuff, and we can have non-UI elements that are simply functional. And this is an example of a non-UI element, is this definition of this endpoint. So I have my endpoint going to /resource. I am saying that my response is going to map into my greeting data element. Since it's in here in the template, since it's part of an instance, it knows what greeting is. And that's what it's going to do. Nothing's triggering it yet. What I'm going to do is take advantage of another one of the kind of lifecycle functions. And I'm going to say ready. So the ready function, when Polymer is ready to go, go ahead and tell the endpoint. Go ahead and hit that endpoint. This we've already kind of seen before. It allows us to refer to our current instance and our current data. This $sign is a hash that gives us access to all the things that are up here in our shadow DOM and our template. So anything that I gave an ID to, an ID such as resource endpoint, I can then reference directly from the $sign. So that's let me simply say, hey, you, go do your thing. So when this page loads, everything's created, you're ready, hit the endpoint, give me some data. Save that, and let's see how we did. And it's working. That's good for getting data and bringing it back. What I would like to do also is I'd like to have some sort of actions that I can do along with this. I'm not simply just getting some static data. I want to go ahead and say do things. Do things is pretty much a similar sort of thing as call a service. We need some sort of control to do that. I also like to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the paper elements, just to have a little bit of a different look. So I imported the core previously. We're going to import the paper now. And we can see all these guys came in. If I look over here in Bower, we can see that I now have all kinds of paper elements to take advantage of. So these are these material design elements that Google likes. I'm going to go ahead and do a similar include as I did for the core. So I'm going to go paper elements and paper elementational. Again, a high-level encapsulation of all the elements in the paper collection. So I have access to any of them by doing that. And down here, I'm going to add a paper icon button, one of the elements. (3D rotation). And let's say when this guy is clicked, do something called reload. Again, taking advantage of the double curly brace notation to refer to things that are part of our model. It's not actually part of our model yet. So let's add the reload function, which actually does the same thing as ready. All right. So now I should have a button, and it should be linked to this function, and it's an icon button. So it's going to use something called 3D rotation, and I'm going to call this refresh. Okay. There's my button, and I click it. You can see it's got kind of a little circular effect. I hope maybe you can see the little circular effect that's coming over the WebEx. The material design buttons kind of have a specific look and feel to them. They're kind of interesting. I'd definitely recommend taking a look at them. This is all standard HTML, standard DOM type stuff. Other kind of CSS libraries and other standard HTML libraries are also usable. I can use regular HTML buttons and everything else in here, and it kind of exactly the same way. So don't feel like you have to use the Google element specifically. But definitely, I think worth experimenting with. It's an interesting idea. Teams doing a lot of work and kind of working with expanding on these ideas, making them nice. So I think I'll be worth your time checking it out. Okay, how are we doing? Okay, we did now. We used our lifecycle events to load it. We had a refresh button. We used the paper button. How are we doing on the time here? Starting to get a little close here, so I think I'm going to skip the toast part of this sample because security itself is a big topic. I'll simply point it out. Another nice little paper element is this thing called a toast, which is a pop-up, little pop-up window that comes up on the bottom. Usually what I would do is I would include this toast, and then inside of the greeting, I create the resource error, and then I would tell that toast to show. So just kind of, again, showing more linking of different data elements down here in the model with what's going on inside of our DOM and taking advantage of some functions. Okay, so security, yes, security, a tremendous topic. If you've been following along with Dave and his series, we're up to 6 parts now, I think, where a lot of that is spent in the nitty-gritty of what's going on with security. We'll not try to relive any of that, but for me, what I was looking for, I think what probably a lot of people are out there looking for, is really just some basic username, password protection, maybe ultimately some user information about roles, so we can do a little bit of authorization inside of our app. But especially for the types of utilities and things that I'm writing, I want something kind of just straightforward that I can get up and running quick. But it's going to give me something better than just simply security to obscurity and pretending that nobody's going to find my website. So common options for security are just basic HTTP security that's implemented in the browser. Spring Session, another great option for security. It's kind of ultimately what I'm settling on because it also has other advantages for managing session and session state. And also OAuth, a great way of providing security for our applications and a very robust kind of enterprise for the way. For security in our app, getting it rolling, if you remember when I wanted something and I wanted my application to have web capabilities, I added a dependency. I am going to do a very similar thing, but here I can come in and I can say I want security. By doing this, I'm now importing the libraries, importing the components that are necessary to implement security, including all the Spring Security libraries and their dependencies. And now, when this application launches, Spring Boot, take a look at that. Bounce this guy. Spring Boot's going to take a look at that. It's going to see that security is there, and it's going to say, oh, Spring Security, I think you must want somebody to protect something. And yes, indeed. We've got now a challenge for username and password here through the browser, just default HTTP security. It's a default setting, but it works. It's the user. My password is a crazy long thing that's spit out here in the logs. But if I use it, I come in. There we go. Back to my app. And I can go ahead and hit that, and that's all good. I can also hit my resource. Clear all that out. I've set my Chrome up so that when I close it, it makes everything go away. And now I come back and hit it again. Can't see that. And also can't see the resource. Okay, so basic security, well and good, I suppose. Let's go ahead and make it look a little bit nicer, though. We don't always want to use HTTP. We want to go ahead and maybe expand this out. So what I did, what we want to do here is we want to come in and add some configuration so that we can control it. So the way our Spring projects work, we can add dependencies by adding libraries. We can also add things by simply creating objects. So I can add demo config. Well, sure, touch element. And add that in. And save that. What I've done now by creating this configuration, by creating something that has a configuration on it, Boot's going to load this guy up for me when it comes up, and it's going to create this configurator, and then we're going to go ahead and call the configure method passing in the security option. So by defining this, overriding this, I'm telling Boot that I want it to go ahead and use mine instead of using the defaults that are built in. I'm going to take a couple little quick cheats on here. If you've been following along, you know we wouldn't be doing this, certainly not in production. We wouldn't be disabling things like this or necessarily using form login. It gives me an easy way to get going, though, and I'll bring this part of the security up. And also, since I'm going to be now changing from the browser challenge to a form challenge, I need to tell security mechanism to ignore these types of things so I actually get my interface. Otherwise, I'll get a challenge or I'll get a non-authorized or something like that when I try to access the things that I want to see so that I can actually log in. So this enables my security. That's good. On my display side, what I want to do is I want to kind of do some extensions. First thing I want to do is I want to have access to some type of control. And I'm going to use kind of the component way here. So we're going to copy it and paste a whole new element into my app. Same way as importing the Bower components for Polymer and such, this could be some other custom component that somebody maybe on my team has made available, or somebody else has made available, or I'm just pulling from some repository. But it's an element now named login, called login element. It has a similar sort of pattern. It's a template. It's got an endpoint. Here I actually have things. I've got a button, right? I've got inputs, and I've got the functionality to go ahead and call all the backend stuff for me. Inside of here now, I want to go ahead and import it, just like I did the other one. Login elements. There's actually two elements in that set. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to expand, take this opportunity here to expand my layout a little bit by turning this not simply into a piece of HTML with some elements in it, but also a full-on template inside of that. The template gives me some certain advantages. So I've moved this core header panel into a template called main template. I can use templates inside of my regular HTML just like anywhere else. And inside here, I've got my content, I've got my greeting display. Since I want kind of a login, log out metaphor, I'm also going to include these. Open that up so we see what we're putting in. This is something called core pages. I have two sections, a section called login and a section called main. Inside my section called login, I've got just a string. Inside my section called main, I've got my typical greeting display. And in here is where I want to put my login control. Login element, ID equals login element. So let's see, I've imported it. I've used it. I've expanded our interface a little bit to include a couple different pages. I've got them located in different spots. That all seems nice. I've overridden our security context so that all of this stuff is available when I load it, but everything else needs to be authenticated. Sounds nice. To get my new security context, I need to bounce my app. That was programming change. Now let's see how we're looking. Just to make sure, get rid of that guy. Nothing up my sleeve. Get a little bit of developer controls. Take a look at what's going on. Okay, 80. Good. I see my title. Something else seems to be missing. Wonder what it could be. Come and we take a look. Probably notice that I did create these pages. I didn't do anything to set it. There are actually ways to go ahead and declaratively set what the default value is for the selection and things of that sort. But I'm going to take advantage now of a different mechanism that I have to add some more functionality around this. In the same way as in the custom element, we had a template and we had some JavaScript to configure it, all as part of my element. I can also add JavaScript right here to go ahead and control the template up on what we're doing on this. So let's add a script. Since my template's just a regular old DOM element, I can use the query selector to go find it. So I find my main template. Inside of main template, I set the variable page to the value login. Template allows me to use the double curly brace, and Polmyer allows me to use the double curly brace here to go ahead and map that data. So when this loads, this template gets created, this JavaScript gets called, and it will set the value of the model page, which will then get propagated to the DOM, which will tell core pages now to go ahead and say login instead. Maybe. I hear it helps if you save your work, and it does. So now I've got a login page. And I'm using my login element that's already mapped out to kind of the correct sort of location. If I look, this all looks well and good. You can see here, if we look here, this is all of these core elements being loaded because we're not doing anything to minify. If I say login, let's see what happens. Yeah, we got a challenge for our username and password, because here I'm using username and I'm using password. Instead of going and looking it up inside of my log window every time, and I'm going to come out here and do is I'm going to make use of this application properties file. That's the first thing I'm going to do. If you all are not using the YAML, I can recommend YAML a lot. YAML is very cool for doing these types of properties things. I'm going to say security user is password. Bounce. Since we have a property change, come back here. Here's sort of warnings we have. Nothing unexpected. Hit login, and presto! Great. Look, it even came back with a result. Problem is, we can't see that result because we didn't change the page. So that's all right, though. We talked about feeding data in previously to elements. We also talked about the idea of capturing data coming out through events. The way we do this, certainly one way of doing this, is to set up event listeners along with our template. Let's put that inside the if block for good form. So in this part, I set the main data element, I set that page. There are a number of events that elements and templates fire, and you can try to capture a variety of them. One of the most convenient ones is this thing called template bound. So when you're working with templates, unless you really know that you need to be ahead of it, I recommend that you wait for template bound. This means that the template's been created and everything's been put together and it's all kind of ready to go. At that point, we can start referencing our hash. So I can reference hash login element, since this is another element inside of my template, right? It's my login element. I gave it an ID. And I can add an event listener to that to capture something called the login event. If we looked at the login element, we would see that when that login service is fired, it comes back to this callback, which then says, fire an event. That's about all it takes to fire an event inside of Polmyer. You say this.fire. If you want to pass some data, you can pass some sort of JSON data or something in there. We're not going to do that. That fires our event back. Up here in our app, we've registered the event listener. User logged in. User logged in then changes the value back or to main, which should switch our page. And then we'll do something else. So let's see how we're doing here. All right, Presto again. Okay, and now we've actually switched. So that's good. Bang, bang, bang. We can hit our service. That's all very good. And we're all pretty happy, right? If we take a look into this and what's going on, we can look at our headers. We can see that we're now using JSession. We've got JSession going on there. We've got, where's my... I was looking for something that said what the that it was security basic. But it's a security basic that we're now using. Actually, when we switch to this using Spring Session, that's right. When we switch with the Spring, what we do is we switch to using JSession ID kind of automatically on the back end. So that ends up working out for us. We look at all these resource requests. Okay, so we've used templates and data binding. We've used HTTP security. We did not explicitly use the logout control. We'll just do that real quick because I've got it as copy and paste. Or not as copy and paste, but I know where to put it. It's nice to have a logout, so I can say scan logout element. Say this guy. Let's turn our switch back on. All right, so now I say log out. This will log us out. And what I didn't do is I didn't say that by default it was hidden. So when it came up initially, it was there. Now it should still. I hear it helps if you put it on the right control as well. Okay, we got log in. Go, we log in. Bang, bang, bang. We go localhost. You can hit it. Kill my session. Sorry. And no. Got to be authenticated. So security definitely working. Straightforward to add, despite the fact that I kind of ignored a couple of very important features. All right, so we've looked at logging, using those controls, putting them in different places, taking advantage of our lifecycle events, our component events, to go ahead and use that. That pushes a model that we kind of had here about as far as we can really do it, right? We've got a client, we've got a resource that we're accessing directly, we've got a server that delivers it to us. A much more common pattern using Spring Session, which again provides a number of various other advantages besides being very useful for security. But we can use Spring Session to go ahead and follow a different sort of pattern, which allows us to put our UI kind of on the front or as Dave would do it, push it all the way up into a gateway through a proxy, but have some sort of a proxying mechanism where the client's interacting with a UI and not interacting going on that backend to that resource directly. So we proxy it through this lightweight proxy, and we manage our security by using a session store for our tokens. So once I'm authenticated with the UI, I store the session or start the session, I hit the resource can also verify that, and everybody is happy to go ahead and return that while not granting the client direct access. The client thinks it's just hitting /resource like it always has, and it's the proxy that's managing that going off to the back and maintaining it. You can do security directly on all the components. It just makes things a lot more complex. If we do it this way, we're really only kind of worrying about this incoming part and where we have to do it there. Instead of having you guys watch me try to copy and paste, especially as we're coming up here to the top of our hour again, what I do have for you, though, is kind of the expanded version of the demo that we've been working on. So pretty much everything that you've seen here, you'll now be seeing and available up on my GitHub site. A few notable exceptions, though, is I've now, instead of it just having been logically separated, I've actually directly separated the resource project from the UI project. So we have our resource is not much different than what we saw before. We'll close all these guys. It's our boot app. It's our same controller. And I'm using now the configuration file in the same way as I did previously to go ahead and set up session sharing with Redis so that I can use HTTP session sharing. I can use this session strategy for my header. So by creating this bean, I just implement a default implementation of that. And then since this is on the resource side, I don't want any basic, right? I want to go ahead and turn that off, and I want to go ahead and make sure everything is authorized coming in. So a little bit definitely tighter security on the back end, but not anything particularly different for our resource, except now that it's just been pulled into its own project. On the UI side, now the resource stuff has been stripped out. Demo application, I'm sure you guys can guess what that is already. The Spring Session Controller, so similar thing. Enable HTTP session. This tells Boot and Spring Session and everybody else to create a Redis data source and do all of the binding. I've got a local Redis server here running. If I deploy this in Cloud Foundry or something, it will use the bound Redis server that's available to it. Let's do all of that. And you can see here, I'm adding more rich and more sophisticated management for my security. So I'm still now turning CSRF back on. It's on by default. I'm using kind of a custom token repository. So one of the things we saw with Dave was that Angular had some pretty rich features for managing this, so long as you got in line with what is expected for names, which is XSRF. So far, I haven't found kind of an analogous thing inside the Polmyer world that manages all of these CSRF problems manually. So I kind of followed Dave's pattern here, and I pass it down in the cookie and send it up with the X. By doing this configuration of this repository like this, this all works fine on the Spring Security side. It's just on the client side that I have to worry about setting the header so that I go ahead and send that value up inside the header itself. So that was a little bit more complex for Polymer than it was for the Angular. But I think that's mostly because Polymer just has some more maturing to do. The Zool config, this is my general application configuration class. I usually create one of these things for my app to do kind of the general stuff that's not specific to a module or part of it. And for that, to enable the Zool proxy, I simply turned it on. I said enable Zool, including the right stuff in my Palm file, and then a little bit of configuration in my YAML, my session, for what that route is. Basically telling Zool, the proxy, when you see /resource, proxy that guy right over here to a different sort of server. So that was our Zool configuration. And you'll see some other things that I've done with the application from what I did with the demo is I've separated the JavaScript out of the index. So instead of having that directly in, it's in its own file, otherwise very similar, using that main template. I have a few more elements that are in here. I've separated out CSS, and we have a much richer CSS available to us that I've been using inside of the app, and give you guys examples how to do some of these things. And a more complicated UI. So I updated the UI a little bit here to go from simply core header panel, which it was previous, to something called a core scaffold. And it's easier to just look at it and talk about it. So I will start the demo on that. There's the resource server. Fire up the UI server. And I've got this one on a different port. See, it's similar, but now somewhat different, right? We've got our whole menu section here over on the side where I can access now the different pages in that select. Very nice to be able to do that. Here in the menu, that's where that menu is defined. I simply use the same value, page, link that into there so that when this guy changes, it sets the value to either login or main. That automatically changes it. All of that data binding now happens just for free to switch these pages just by linking in those names. Extremely powerful, gets rid of a ton of code. I will say it makes it a little obscure when you're coming in trying to figure it out, how everything is linked together. Some better commenting on my part will make that, I think, a lot more obvious what's going on. I think commenting, especially for these types of really rich features, is pretty important so that we can kind of follow the bouncing ball. Otherwise, it's not so obvious that this guy here and this guy here are some sort of now magic link. But in terms of scraping out a bunch of boilerplate, linking into this and posting this, like just fantastic stuff with the data binding. Same thing with our page selector here. Something that I will point out in the CSS, a little kind of subtlety here, is that Polymer made it really easy to set those core header panel and core toolbar. If you remember last time, I set that to red, and it was our beautiful red banner on the top. Well, when you do it this time, you set this one over here on the left. Getting access to this one that I set green is a little bit more complicated. It's complicated because if I look at the DOM, I look at my elements, you see I've got my core scaffold, good. Got my core header panel, that's that stuff all on the left, right? I can see my toolbar, but if you look at that, you can see that it's actually not the entire area, right? Well, the question then becomes, where is that area? And it actually happens to be buried in the shadow DOM. So here's kind of there's that isolation aspect that we were talking about. The shadow DOM isn't really directly available as you would expect it. You have to come into this thing called shadow root, come down, look down here. So here, now we see our core header panel. Now we open that guy up, we see our core toolbar, and that's actually the whole thing. Okay, so now we just need to know it was in the shadow root. A little annoying. Dealing with it, easy enough. You just had to know that it was there. So I say, hey, in that core scaffold, you know what, look in the shadow, and then go out and find the core toolbar and then style it for me, right? So a bit annoying. Could be easier to get at some of those. So we'll see if the Google guys do something that kind of make that a little bit more obvious. Other than that, works the same way. Log in, refresh. You can switch the pages if you like. Log out, refresh. So you can see all that and look what's going on with the network. Data binding, JavaScript. I also included support for the CSRF. So we saw that a bit on the server side. You'll be able to dig through and see that in the element side as well. The element side, yeah. I will get to the right file, I promise. Where we get in here and I actually deal with getting that guy out of the header and pushing that into our various endpoints. So I specifically set the header. It's actually really easy to set a header inside of the core Ajax components. When I do the post, you can just go ahead and come in here and do something like this, right? The header is a string, so we want to stringify this JSON object using the JSON library. That sets that string. Make the string yourself, whichever you like. But now that pushes that header out there. And if we look at these various requests, then we can see either XOF token or XSRF token. So for the actual real live calls that are coming up, we're either adding XSRF. Spring Security then reads that on the backside. The XSRF looks in its repository, XSRF, and finds that everybody's happy. And then we can store that in the session store, and then everybody, or not, that's the auth token, then is the one that's stored on the session store, and that's pushed into the back. You can see XSRF down there also in the cookie. Okay, so that was kind of what I had to show you. Overall, kind of my net result as a user, as a Java developer, the Spring stuff was just super easy to use, super productive for all of the backend. And I felt that the Polymer stuff was also very straightforward to use, even though there's kind of some of these room scroll, little bumps and bruises along the way. I particularly enjoy the focus on components. The other frameworks, especially Angular that I looked at, very MVC-oriented. Its model was harder for me to kind of follow. I'm sure I could have learned it, but it just didn't kind of come as easy to me. Hopefully they can address some of this funkiness as they continue to evolve this. We'll see what happens with that. Something always to be considered with any project that we're looking at, no matter how cool it is how real it is and what sort of legs we think this project might have. We've certainly kind of seen this picture before, right? The GWT, lots of noise around GWT now. Well, I personally thought it was pretty much dead. I think Peter was letting me know that it's still kind of on life support out there. There are some fanboys, but not the type of support. Google definitely walked away from that guy to do other interesting things, which is what Google does. We both love them and hate them for it. There are indicators that Polymer here has a lot going for it. It's now officially on production track. The Polymer guys say that groups over there inside of Google, like YouTube, are using it, going to be using it, are going to be adopting it. There's a tremendous amount of buzz that continues to kind of follow up around it as an extension to web components and as people are starting to evolve and make use of web components. The race is definitely open. People have asked a little bit about, what about React and Twitter? What about these other frameworks? It's a little bit of an open race, especially with Angular kind of turning into a different or new thing. It's now becoming just another framework in the group out there, all trying to vie for everybody's attention since there's no upgrade path. So at Polymer, I think got as good a shot as anything. Would I recommend production applications? Probably not today. Definitely would wait until after it's got the official blessing from Google as a production, and then probably even a little bit after that if I'm really being paranoid. But for my work like this, production or non-production, departmental apps, things like that, is just perfect. Places to go, Polymer project for all things Polymer, Spring.io for all things Spring. I will be posting the kind of final demo app, the expanded demo app, up on GitHub. It's a little behind at the moment, so give me maybe until the end of the day. I'll get a version up on it. You'll notice I also have some OAuth stuff in there. I will be continuing to expand this app. My ultimate idea is to have kind of a combined app that allows me to do either Spring Session or OAuth for authentication, but we'll see how that goes. Dave Sires blog series, can't recommend it enough, and I will be doing a mini blog on all this to go along with the source code that I'm committing to Peter and the team to have out by the end of the month.
Awesome.
So with that, I'll ask Peter, any questions there in the chat window?
Yeah, we got a whole bunch. Great, thank you. So I think the first question was sort of, when you use Polymer instead of Angular, why to prefer Polymer? I think you kind of really sort of covered that in the context of the conversation, and I'm not sure that you're necessarily advocating one or the other. They're just alternatives. But if you have an opinion on that, feel free.
Yeah, the only thing that I would say is that Angular came out 6 some odd years ago now. And it's done a lot of this stuff, but in a kind of non-standards-oriented way. They are also looking on getting on top of web components as well, so you see movement by the Angular guys. If you're an Angular developer and you like it, you certainly, I'd say, keep using it. Lots of stuff happening in that area, though, and I think there's a lot of question marks around it. So that's kind of my guidance. But no, I'm not specifically advocating Polymer as the greatest thing since sliced bread. But it is actually pretty good, and I've enjoyed using it personally.
Cool. Yeah, and one of the other webinar attendees made that exact same comment about, how it's kind of a Polymer sort of enabling web components, the web component standard usage on today's browsers. Let's see. Sudhir asks, can you manage or import components by version?
Yes, Bower has a lot of features for supporting the specific versions. Maybe even kind of hit that super quick.
We have a ton of questions, so if it's a yes/no type thing,
it's this type thing. You look at your dependencies and you express specific versions.
Cool. Pujitha asks, how is the UI server running? That was at about 10:30, so about 40% of the way through.
Right. So I guess by UI server, since we weren't to the new app yet, it was this demo application. So much of this is really the magic of Spring Boot. By telling Boot that I've got an endpoint and a web library, it just creates all of that context for us to run in, just magically. We could peel back a lot of that and look at Tomcat configurations and stuff like that. But Boot does that. Boot is magic. It really is. It's rainbows and unicorns.
Yeah, it just cleans out a ton of boilerplate code, and to just add a teeny little bit to that, Fujita. It'll embed Tomcat for you, and just because Scott used certain annotations like the @rest controller there and the Boot just knows that means you need a web container, and it will configure a Tomcat or a Netty for you and embed it inside your application without you having to do a darn thing. So it just makes enterprise Java in general about as code concise and boilerplate free as something like Ruby. Ruby on Rails.
It looks for things in the standard location. So it just looks for static. It would look for public as well. If you were using a templating engine like Thymeleaf or something, it would look for the templates there. And, of course, anything application YAML or properties, it just finds it all.
That's awesome. I love it when people just kind of notice the Boot magic in these webinars, and they're like, wait, what is that? That's awesome. How did that work exactly?
I pushed the easy button is what I did.
Exactly. Nambi asks if you can do a view source as well when the UI changes.
Yes, you can. The view source, though, is just the HTML, right? So what you really kind of want to be looking at is these developer tools to kind of look at what's happening on kind of the underside if you want to see what's happening with particular request responses, if you want to look at what's going on inside of all of the elements and things like that and what their properties are. And you can see all that change, but view source is the hard way to go because so much of this stuff is dynamic. Really, really can't. If you're in Firefox, use Firebug. If you're in Chrome, use Chrome Developer Tools. Whatever it is, they're awesome.
Yep, totally. Yeah, because the HTML is just kind of the final rendering. Let's see. How does Polymer compare to using Angular directives to define components?
So Angular directives were the kind of non-standard Angular way of doing that sort of stuff. So it's a similar idea, but Polymer elements are then based off of the web components.
Got it. So it's directives reimagined as the web component standard. Got it. Okay. Yeah. Let's see. Is it a good practice to use non-UI web components instead of a framework? I think we addressed that.
Non-UI components are great. Polymer guys use them all the time. See them all over.
Yep. Fair enough. A couple comments from people when you were like, I'm not really going to talk about the security. They're like, no, please.
Unfortunately, guys, I can't replicate 6 hours of data fire. The amazingness of what's in Dave's blog is
totally. I was just about to say that. Dave kind of covers that pretty well in his blog series. So go check that out. It's just posted to the Spring.io blog. It's easy to find.
Yeah.
It's now a 6-part blog series.
Yeah.
So the return of the blog will be followed by the blog awakens in part 7.
Right, and I'm working on that. Then my goal, like I said, is to kind of do a combined app, because I'd like to see that option. Here's your login credentials, or use Google or Facebook or Cloud Foundry or something like that, OAuth login, and see how I can make that happen.
Right. So all these comments actually are kind of coming from the same person, a gentleman named Vineet Bhatia, and he was curious what Dave Sires' challenge is. And Vineet, it's this blog that Dave wrote where he was using Angular as a front end, or just kind of JavaScript as a front end in general, right? And using Spring Cloud, which is some of the Netflix open source wrapped, it's their Zool router, to use as a sort of a very lightweight API gateway between the JavaScript front end and a Spring back end, and it just neatly solves a ton of problems without being, an uber heavyweight API gateway product. And it's just sort of, again, as Spring always is, right? Embeddable library, good for development. So next question, let's see. Ben Zhang asks if this is HTML5 compatible. Ooh, good question, Ben.
Yes. Web Components is kind of like the next round of standards after HTML5.
Yep. Okay, cool. And then how can we, Vineet came back to ask a really good question. How can we write unit tests for Polymer? That's a question, isn't it, Scott? Yeah.
That is a great question, and JavaScript testing frameworks are evolving very rapidly, and I have not been keeping up with them, so I would be a very poor person to answer that question, unfortunately. Last time I tried to use them, they were just garbage. I hated them. They were terrible. They've evolved a lot, and I would go to look at standard testing frameworks. There should be really pretty full compatibility. There's nothing specific about, there's the web component stuff, but after that, it's all HTML and JavaScript and DOM type stuff. So that's why the CSS all kind of works and everything like that. So I expect that if they don't support Polymer, the Polymer guys have already been evolving it to have a test framework to support them specifically. So take a look out for that. But unfortunately, I agree. We need something like that, and I don't know what it is.
Got it. So Fabio asks, you mentioned Zool. I just read a little bit about it during the presentation. When do you recommend usage?
Always. For my pattern, always. I like having the proxy thing solves a lot of the security issues just by creating that single choke point. So I think it's just a great pattern. If you grow up huge and you need massive, type scaling and proxying, that's a different problem. But for these type of apps, I think it's a tremendous pattern. Dave pushes it way out into the front. If you look at Dave Part 6, he's got the Zool gateway way out on the front end. I think for smaller apps like what I'm writing, which would be considered an internal app or departmental app, I think a combined UI server and Zool proxy is perfectly adequate. But as that grows up, take a look at Dave's series to see how you can to abstract that into more components.
Just to add a little bit to that, its original sort of intended usage inside the Spring Cloud is for, a lot of it's sort of service-to-service calls and intelligent routing, right? Because if you're looking at a microservice type of architecture where you have lots of little services, you might want the router to be aware of certain state of, you might need the router to be aware of certain things, whether services are available or not available, whether they're dead or alive or things like that, not just kind of like the sort of typical dumb round robin load balancing. So when you need that intelligent routing in the microservices context, service to service calls, that's what Zool was initially, I think, developed for. And I think Dave's just appropriated it and as in this case, because it's great for this lightweight API gateway where, you want something to help you address some of your security issues, but you're not looking for like a full-blown API gateway product that would just be too much or a lot more than you'd need to just handle these concerns. Something like a Mastery or Apogee, which are great products, by the way, but just, it's like right tool for the right job and scope. So I think that's just kind of at the high level. I'm sure there's other use cases for Zool. Netflix talks about it tons, so just go out and look at Netflix open source and look up Zool, and you'll see oodles and oodles and oodles of stuff about it. Next question was from, let's see. Okay, this is another kind of comparison question. I think we've had a lot of those, so I'm going to skip that. And a helpful comment from Dan about unit testing and project on Polymer. He posted that to the chat, or to the Q&A, which is great. Let's see. I think Daihua Yi asks, about, hey, is this ready for production? What do we need to worry about? I think you kind of covered that. Is there anything you want to add, or?
I would add that there are people using it. I don't myself, and I do not advocate or recommend using it for production apps. That is not stopping people. Example here. Actually, I turned it off. So I installed this thing called Tabby. I can enable it, but it uses Polymer, and I was kind of taking a look at it. If I look at my extensions, we'll enable Tabby. So this is actually a full Polymer interface that these guys are using for their extension, and you can go ahead and you can see it's got that papery feel to it, right? And then it's doing stuff on here for me, and this has the whole Polymer layout. For me personally, no, I would not be using it in production. When I talk with Pivotal Labs guys, and I have been talking with some of them about Polymer, we have the same sort of conversation, which is this is something that when it's really blessed, I think we can move forward with using. But for right now, it's tier 2 type things. And, if it blows up or it's weird, then it's okay.
Last couple questions. I'm jumping back around a little bit. I did these out of order. The Spring session use OAuth 2? And I know you're not necessarily saying Spring session expert, but...
Right. Spring, they're kind of somewhat different sort of things, right? Spring session is the token store, right? And it allows us to do storage of, lots of stuff, actually. Spring session is the general storage. And then we use it to do that token storage with the HTTP token. When you have OAuth, then you have an OAuth server kind of available to you. So you don't, that becomes your token store and you check with it. I might.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So go ahead now. Maybe hit the next question. I'll pull up a diagram here.
Sure. Yeah. I think this is next to last one, or almost the last one, because seriously, we're almost 11:30 here.
Yep.
Are there any IDEs which have support for Polymer or web components? I think maybe.
Oh, actually, great question. That's really one for the Google guys, but yes. The answer to that question is yes. If I look over at Polymer's website, but scroll down just a little bit, and you'll see that they have a designer. Right, I did all this in code, but they have a Polymer designer out there to go ahead and pull these things together and use that. So if you want to use a more WYSIWYG type designer, this is the way it is, or this is what they have for you.
Sweet. Okay, cool. I think I know there's literally like one or two questions on it, but all right. I think maybe we can squeeze in this very last one. Alex asked that he's making that the new Google Store and Google Contacts are using Polymer. Can you confirm if that's the case? But I mean, maybe, but I don't know. We're not Google.
Right. The last guys at that Polymer project, when they were, I kind of listened to them talking, they were talking about the internal teams adopting Polymer. YouTube was the one that I remembered. It doesn't surprise me that the other groups would be adopting it.
There's a browser plugin out there for Chrome called Built With, and sometimes it will figure out, what the, it can tell you what a particular site is built with, although it's kind of hit or miss. Sometimes it's aware of the back-end technology or the front-end technology, and sometimes it just isn't. So, but you can try it, Alex, if you want. It's called Built With. It often works, although not always, which is probably like any IT answer. But anyway, all right. Well, Scott, thanks so much. This has been great. I just want to make everyone aware that, yes, this webinar is being recorded. We will be posting it as we always do, to the spring.io/blog. That's probably the best thing to do in terms of subscribing to that. If you want to get a notification of when the replay is available, and Scott, Scott sends me his slides, and after he posts them to Speaker Deck or SlideShare or whatever if you don't like SlideShare, Scott, that's usually what we do with the rest of the Spring engineers. And then we'll put a link to the slides and also the session recording, and that'll happen within about a week or two. So please come back and join us, though. We've got a number of other really cool webinars coming up. We're going to be coming out in April. We've got two fun webinars coming up. One on Spring XD and using Kafka. So if you're into big data, that'll be a good one for you to check out. And then the next one from Josh Long is on smarter service-to-service invocations with Spring Cloud. So if you were interested in this sort of Zool router and the Netflix open source bit, again, this is more sort of machine-to-machine, API-to-API, microservice-to-microservice type of context, as opposed to, being a lightweight API gateway between, a JavaScript front end and a Spring back end. So a little bit different of a context, but as you can see, just a lot of utility for some of these Netflix open source projects, and Spring Cloud is really making those super easy to use, especially with the Spring Boot support. You can just get to an amazing brevity of code. So please go to spring.io, and if you go to the search, little search widget, which I believe is in the upper right-hand corner, and you type in the word webinar, I think webinar : you should see a list of all the upcoming webinars, and you can find the registration pages for those webinars. Or just do webinar : and then maybe the name of the particular webinar. So if you're looking to get a hold of Spring security bits, we do obviously have them on spring.io. We try to really encourage people to use Maven or Gradle to get them, though. If you're on a closed network and you really desperately need an HTTP download, you can get those. We don't really make it super easy for you, to be honest, but you can get those from repo.spring.io if you really want them. Again, some people on military networks, some people on closed networks. You just need something. So let's see. And Scott, if you want to make some quick closing comments while I go dig back up the URLs for the next two webinars, then and I'll post those in the chat while you're making any sort of final comments. That'd be great.
Sure. Just like to thank everybody for attending. This was something that came out of kind of my own needs, not necessarily just pulling it together for fun, but I had this app that I needed to write, and this direction I thought was a lot of fun. I don't always get the chance to write code anymore, so it's been a little while since I've been monkeying around inside of the JavaScript and front-end layers, but it's been really exciting to see all of this evolution that's going on. The only other thing I might say is that take it also with a grain of salt that today's hotness is yesterday's old news, and we can expect that all of these technologies are going to be changing very fast with HTTP2 and WebSockets and everything kind of moving to start dominate our world a lot more. So good stuff here for the midterm, but so much great technology continuing to come down the pipeline.
Awesome, Scott. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time, and have a great day, everyone. I hope to see you for some of the April webinars on Big Data, Spring XD, and Spring Cloud Service-to-Service Invocations with Josh Long. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.